The morning was ordinary, deceptively so. Outside, the November chill crept into every corner of our small town. I had been on vacation for a while, and with 3 days left before returning to work, I was doing what any husband might when his wife was out: absolutely nothing. The television hummed in the background, its glow bouncing off the walls of our modest living room. I flicked through the channels without purpose, the soft murmurs of talk shows blending into static in my head. My wife, Angelica, a dedicated math teacher, had left earlier that morning. She kissed me on the cheek on her way out, her perfume lingering in the air like a quiet echo. She had an unshakable routine, structured, like her lesson plans, and I admired her for it. She made us look like a team, something solid, something untouchable. But today, boredom gnawed at me, and the house felt too still. It wasn't the kind of stillness that soothes. It was something heavier. Restlessness settled over me like a too-tight jacket. It had been years since I'd visited Angelica's school, but on a whim, I decided to go. Not to disturb her, just to see her, to admire her. She'd always been captivating, effortlessly beautiful, even in her simplest outfits, and I found pride in being her husband. The school was quiet when I arrived, its brick exterior as familiar as ever. Inside, the scent of chalk dust and freshly polished floors brought back memories of long-forgotten PTA meetings and school fairs. The sound of distant laughter echoed down the hallway. I navigated the maze of corridors until I found Angelica's classroom. She was sitting at her desk, her eyes fixed on a young man across from her. He looked about 19, maybe a senior. His posture was too casual for a student, leaned back slightly, with an air of confidence. Angelica's hand rested on the edge of her desk as she spoke, her tone calm but serious, her expressions sharp and animated. I didn't interrupt. I lingered outside, just out of sight, catching fragments of their conversation. He nodded at her words, his responses barely audible from where I stood. It wasn't the boy that caught my attention. It was the way she seemed utterly absorbed in their exchange. The world outside that classroom didn't exist for her at that moment. When she finally noticed me standing there, her eyes widened in surprise, and her voice broke through my haze. "Brian, what are you doing here?" Her smile, warm and genuine, erased the odd knot that had been tightening in my chest. "I was bored," I replied, shrugging like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Thought I'd drop by." She glanced at the boy, murmured something, and he nodded, gathering his things before slipping past me with a polite nod. The room suddenly felt larger, quieter. Angelica stepped forward, her hands reaching for mine, and for a moment I forgot my unease. We talked, her laughter filling the room as I teased her about the mountains of books on her desk. She walked me to the door, where we exchanged a quick kiss before she glanced at the clock and sighed. "Time for class," she said, her tone slipping into the professional calm she wore so well. On the drive home, I replayed the scene in my head, marveling at her beauty and the way she had everything under control. I told myself I was lucky, muttering it aloud like a mantra. What a beautiful wife I have. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a question lingered, quiet but persistent. Why did she leave him after class? After a while, I realized that I was paranoid, and that was it. I told myself I was being ridiculous. The boy in her classroom was just a student, nothing more. Angelica was dedicated to her work, and that passion was one of the many reasons I loved her. It wasn't fair of me to let some lingering doubt, a moment of distraction, take root. I pushed the thought aside, burying it beneath layers of trust. My wife was faithful, I reminded myself. She'd never give me a reason to think otherwise. By the time she came home that evening, the unease had mostly faded. I greeted her at the door with a warm smile, only to find her looking utterly drained. Her usual cheer was missing, her face pale, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. She hung her bag on the hook and shuffled into the living room, kicking off her heels with a groan. "Long days?" I asked, following her to the dining table. "You have no idea," she replied, dropping into a chair. Her voice carried a weariness I wasn't used to. It was one thing after another. We ate in near silence, the quiet interrupted only by the clinking of utensils. I didn't press her for details. I could tell she wasn't in the mood for small talk. But halfway through the meal, she spoke up, her tone light, but edged with something I couldn't quite place. That student I was with today, Leo, his name is, he stayed after school to ask about extra lessons. He wants to go deeper into the material, and I offered to tutor him. I set my fork down, her words catching me off guard. Extra lessons? At school, right? No, she said, shaking her head. Here at home. He suggested it, and it just made sense. He's really motivated, Brian. I think it could be good for him. Her tone was casual, as if this was no big deal, but something in her words made me pause. Angelica, our house isn't a school. I don't think it's a good idea to bring strangers into our home, no matter how motivated they are. She froze for a moment, her fork hovering midair, before setting it down with a sharp clink. What's wrong with that? She snapped, her voice rising unexpectedly. Are you afraid of a student coming here to learn? He's just a kid, Brian. Her sudden outburst stunned me. Angelica rarely raised her voice, and when she did, it wasn't over something so trivial. What? I shot back, louder than I intended. Why the hell are you yelling at me? I didn't even say anything to you. The words hung in the air between us, the tension crackling like static. Her expression softened almost immediately, her shoulders slumping as she let out a long sigh. I'm sorry, she muttered, running a hand through her hair. I didn't mean to snap. It's just been a hard day. Honestly, Leo's one of the best students I've ever had. He's brilliant, and I want to help him succeed. I stared at her, trying to make sense of the situation. She looked genuinely remorseful, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. And yet, her earlier reaction lingered in my mind, an uncomfortable echo I couldn't ignore. It's okay, I said eventually, forcing a small smile. I get it. You're passionate about your work. But maybe we could figure out another way, somewhere outside the house. She nodded, though her gaze remained fixed on her plate, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her glass. We finished the meal in silence, the earlier argument hanging between us like smoke. I wanted to let it go, to chalk it up to stress, but something about the entire exchange gnawed at me. Her anger, her insistence on bringing the boy into our home, it didn't sit right. Later that night, as we lay in bed, I glanced at her, half asleep beside me. Her breathing was slow and steady, her expression peaceful. For the 100th time that day, I told myself I was overthinking it. She was my wife, my Angelica. She wouldn't hurt me. But as I stared at the ceiling, the words she'd said earlier whispered through my mind like a taunt. I want to spend a lot of time with him. I didn't sleep well. The morning light seeped through the blinds, painting the walls in soft, golden hues. I rolled out of bed slowly, the echoes of last night's tension still faintly lingering in the back of my mind. Angelica was already gone, her side of the bed neatly made, as always. She had her routines, her habits, and I had grown so accustomed to them that they often passed unnoticed. But this morning, as I stood in the quiet of our kitchen with a cup of coffee, I replayed the events of the previous evening. Her outburst, her apology, the way she had framed her explanation about the student. It had all seemed unusual, but as I mulled it over, I realized I was being overly critical. Angelica loved math, and if this boy truly shared her passion, then why shouldn't she help him? He was just a teenager, eager to learn. I could see how much she wanted to make a difference. Maybe my initial reaction had been harsh, more rooted in some baseless instinct than reason. I sat at the table, sipping my coffee and staring at my phone, the thought nagging at me to call her. I had 2 more days off, and to be honest, the thought of her enthusiasm being dampened by my overreaction was bothering me. I unlocked my phone and dialed her number. Brian? Angelica's voice was breathless when she answered, likely caught in the middle of her day. Everything okay? Yes, I said quickly, leaning back in my chair. I've been thinking about last night. I've changed my mind. If you want to tutor Leo here, I'm okay with it. There was a beat of silence, and then a burst of laughter, pure, unrestrained joy. Really? She exclaimed. Oh, Brian, thank you. Thank you so much. You have no idea how happy this makes me. I smiled at the sound of her excitement. It was the kind of happiness that reminded me why I fell in love with her in the first place. But before her enthusiasm swept us too far, I added, "There's just one thing." "Anything," she said, her voice eager. "You could bring him over, but only when I'm not home. I've got 2 days left to relax before work, and I'd like to keep the house quiet while I can." "Deal? Deal," she said without hesitation. "You're the best, Brian. Really. I'll make sure everything is perfect. Kisses." The call ended, and I set the phone down, feeling lighter. Angelica's happiness was contagious, and I loved being the one to put that joy in her voice. I could imagine her now, her face lit up with excitement as she made plans in her head. It felt good, knowing I was supporting her even in small ways like this. When 30 minutes passed, and the house was silent again, I found myself thinking about her reaction the night before. The way she had snapped at me, the sudden shift in her tone, it had caught me off guard. Was it really just stress? Or had I stumbled upon something deeper without realizing it? I shook my head, chastising myself for letting such thoughts creep in again. Angelica was a dedicated teacher, passionate about her students. She saw potential in that boy, and she wanted to help him succeed. That's all there was to it. I had overreacted, let my imagination get the better of me. Still, as I sat there in the kitchen, the thought of her happiness kept me rooted. It was a reminder of the trust we had built over the years, the strength of our bond. Whatever had happened last night, it was behind us now, and for the first time since the whole conversation began, I felt truly at ease. When Angelica walked through the door that evening, her excitement was palpable, like a kid arriving home with a report card full of A's. She didn't even take her coat off before exclaiming, "Brian, I can't wait for these one-on-one lessons." All day, I was just imagining sitting at the table, solving problems, working through equations. It's like a dream come true. Her enthusiasm washed over me like warm sunlight, and I found myself smiling despite the faint unease that had lingered since our last conversation about the student. Angelica loved her work. It was one of the things I admired most about her. And who was I to dampen her spirits over something so innocent? "I'm glad you're happy," I said, pulling her into a quick hug. "Just don't wear yourself out." The following 2 days passed quickly. Each morning, Angelica buzzed with anticipation. By the time I woke up on the second day, she was already up, practically bouncing as she brewed coffee. "Today's the day," she announced, grinning from ear to ear. Her energy was contagious, and I couldn't help but chuckle. "Don't scare the poor kid with all this enthusiasm," I teased, sipping from my mug. The morning passed in a blur. I got dressed and left for work around 8 a.m., my wife trailing me to the door. "Good luck today," she said, giving me a peck on the cheek. "And don't worry, I'll make sure everything is perfect." I nodded, waving as I climbed into my car. The arrangement was simple. She'd be done with her school day by 3, I'd be home by 7, and there'd be no overlap with her tutoring session. Everything seemed fine. Work, as always, was brutal. The hours flew by, swallowed by a sea of emails, phone calls, and deadlines. By the time I clocked out, my body ached, and my mind was desperate for a moment of quiet. All I wanted was to sink into the couch, maybe flip on the TV for a bit. But as I pulled into the driveway, something immediately caught my eye. A bike leaning against the porch railing. I knew exactly whose it was. Stepping inside, the sound of laughter greeted me. Angelica's voice, warm and animated, floated through the house, accompanied by a younger, deeper laugh. My heart sank. I had been explicit about the timing. He wasn't supposed to be here when I got home. Yet there they were, voices rising and falling in a symphony of problem-solving and camaraderie. I walked into the living room and saw them sitting at the dining table. Angelica's face lit up as she gestured to something in her notebook, her eyes sparkling with the kind of joy I hadn't seen in a while. The boy, Leo, looked up the moment I stepped in, his expression freezing as if he'd been caught red-handed. "Hello," I said, my voice tight. Angelica turned, startled by my sudden presence. "Brian, you're home early," she said, glancing at the clock. "It's 7, I replied. "Right on time?" Leo quickly stood, gathering his things. "I was just leaving, sir," he said, his tone polite but hurried. He shoved his notebook into his bag, gave Angelica a quick nod, and all but bolted out the door. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Angelica rose from the table and followed me into the bedroom, where I had already collapsed onto the bed, my arms folded behind my head. She slid in beside me, her body warm against mine as she wrapped an arm around my chest. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice soft. "I didn't mean for him to stay so late. We got carried away with the lesson." I exhaled slowly, trying to temper the irritation simmering beneath the surface. "It's fine," I said, though my tone betrayed me. "Just don't let it happen again, okay?" She nodded, her head resting on my shoulder. "Okay," she whispered. "I promise." We lay there in silence for a while, her breath steady against my neck. I wanted to believe her, to trust that this had been a one-off mistake. But something about the situation gnawed at me. The way Leo had scrambled to leave, the way Angelica had rushed to explain, it didn't sit right. Still, I closed my eyes and told myself to let it go. She had apologized, and that should have been enough. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized I wasn't as tired as I thought. My body was still, but my mind was wide awake, replaying the scene over and over. Something about it didn't feel right. That night, I did what any exhausted husband would do after a grueling day. I went through the motions. I sank into the couch, letting the hum of the TV wash over me. The images on the screen blurred together. Some sports recap, a sitcom rerun, and finally, the evening news. None of it registered. My mind was elsewhere, though I couldn't quite say where. Eventually, the weight of the day pulled me to bed. Angelica was already asleep, her breathing steady. I watched her for a moment, letting the soft rise and fall of her chest lull me into the edges of sleep. Whatever lingering thoughts I had about Leo, about her apology, I shoved them aside. Sleep took me quickly. The next morning, I woke early. The alarm hadn't even gone off yet. I dressed, grabbed my keys, and headed to work. This day was a real beast. Meetings were nonstop. Deadlines crept up with every tick of the clock. By the time I clocked out, my muscles felt as though they'd been wrung dry. The drive home was a blur, my eyelids heavy as I tried to focus on the road. All I could think about was getting a cold beer and taking off my work clothes. When I pulled into the driveway at 7 sharp, my headlights swept across a figure on a bicycle. It was Leo, pedaling away from the house. His head was low, his shoulders hunched, as though he were trying to avoid being seen. I frowned, but said nothing, chalking it up to nothing more than coincidence. When I walked in, Angelica's voice called out from another room, sharp and cheery. "Did you forget something, dear?" she shouted. The words threw me. Forget something? The question hung in the air as I moved toward the fridge. I didn't bother replying, my focus set on the beer waiting for me. The cold can hissed as I cracked it open, the first sip easing the tension in my shoulders. But then I noticed something odd. Angelica was standing by the closet in the hallway, facing away from me. She was hurriedly changing, her back turned, her hands fumbling with the clasp of her bra. She looked over her shoulder and froze when she saw me, her face flushing. She was out of breath, her hair damp around her neck. It wasn't the kind of sweat from a workout. It was something else entirely. For a moment, my mind churned with questions. Why was she changing here? Why hadn't she used the bedroom? But I dismissed it just as quickly. I was too tired to care. With my beer in hand, I walked past her without a word and slumped into the couch, flipping on the TV. Angelica joined me not long after, a tight smile on her face as she sat down beside me. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice a little too bright. There was an edge to it, a slight tremor she couldn't quite hide. "Hard," I said simply, not bothering to elaborate. I took another sip of my beer, the cool liquid dulling the edges of my thoughts. She nodded, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I can imagine," she said, her tone careful, measured. Then she tilted her head, trying for nonchalance. Mine was interesting. There it was. That hesitation, that slight pause before the word. It was enough to catch my attention, but only for a second. I glanced at her, noting the way she avoided my eyes, the way her fingers twisted the hem of her shirt. "What was interesting about it?" I asked, my tone more curious than accusatory. "Oh, nothing major," she said quickly, the words tumbling out. "Just a lot of lessons, some grading, you know how it is." I nodded, but I didn't respond. My mind was too drained to pick apart her words, too dulled to question the faint unease that prickled at the back of my mind. Whatever it was she was hiding, I didn't have the energy to care. Instead, I finished my beer, tossed the can into the trash, and headed to bed. Angelica lingered in the living room when I closed the bedroom door behind me. Sleep came slowly that night, and when it did, it was restless. The next morning, I woke at 5, but this time I didn't get out of bed right away. Instead, I lay there, staring at the ceiling as the events of the previous day played back in my mind. Leo leaving on his bike. Angelica's voice, calling out as though expecting him to return. The sight of her in the hallway, hurriedly changing her clothes, her flushed face and damp hair. Her nervous smile, the way she stumbled over her words when I asked about her day. I turned these moments over in my mind, one by one, trying to make sense of them. Each piece felt innocuous on its own, but together, they painted a picture I didn't want to see. Why was she so nervous? Why was she changing like that? And why, when I had asked her about her day, did she seem so eager to deflect? My gut twisted, a faint unease spreading through me. Something about the whole situation felt off. But as much as I tried to piece it together, exhaustion won out. I told myself there was nothing there. Nothing at all. Still, the questions lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The day started like any other. I clocked in at the usual time, expecting a grind as relentless as the day before. But then, out of nowhere, my boss pulled me aside. "Brian," he said with a grin, "not much going on today. We're wrapping up early, should be out of here by 4. The news hit me like a jolt of caffeine. I couldn't help but smile as I imagined the look on Angelica's face when I came home early. She always loved surprises, and I pictured her lighting up as I walked through the door. I decided not to call her. The thought of catching her off guard made the whole idea more exciting. I'd spent the past few days carrying around a cloud of tension, and this felt like the perfect way to clear the air. As the hours dragged on, though, little flashes of yesterday kept creeping into my mind. The bike, the hurried change of clothes, the slightly off-kilter tone in her voice. They were just fragments, really, but they played like a broken record in the background of my thoughts. I told myself I was being ridiculous. What could there possibly be between Angelica and Leo? The very idea seemed laughable. I shook it off, refocusing on the task at hand. By the time I clocked out, my earlier excitement had returned. On the way home, I stopped by a florist and picked up a bouquet, bright, colorful, the kind of flowers that made her eyes sparkle. It was a small gesture, but I was sure it would mean the world to her. I pulled into the driveway at 4:15, humming to myself, but my heart sank the moment I saw it. The bike, propped against the porch railing, it was unmistakable. For a moment, I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, the bouquet resting on the passenger seat. "Oh shit," I muttered under my breath. There he was again. The idea of walking in with flowers in hand felt absurd now. I didn't want Leo to see, didn't want to make a spectacle of myself in front of him. So I left the bouquet in the car and headed for the back door instead. I moved quietly, my steps soft against the porch as I approached. I told myself it was to preserve the surprise, but deep down, there was something else, a faint unease I couldn't quite shake. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, careful not to make a sound. The first thing I noticed was the breathing, labored, uneven, like someone catching their breath after a sprint. Then came the clapping sounds, faint but rhythmic, accompanied by low murmurs. I froze in the doorway, my pulse quickening as I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. And then I heard Leo's voice. "Otak," he said, the words drawn out in a tone I couldn't quite place. I stood there, rooted in place, my mind racing to connect the dots. Tak? What was that supposed to mean? My feet moved almost without my permission, carrying me toward the kitchen. Each step felt heavier than the last, the sounds growing clearer with every inch I closed. When I rounded the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. They were there, Angelique and Leo, in the middle of the kitchen, a scene I had desperately tried to convince myself would never happen. She was sitting on the countertop, her blouse half-buttoned and her skirt hiked up. Leo was on his knees. Her head was tilted back, her face flushed with an expression I hadn't seen in years. The sound of my own breathing drowned out everything else. My vision tunneled, the edges of the room blurring as the reality of what I was seeing hit me like a freight train. Angelica's eyes snapped open, and for a brief moment, she froze, her mouth half open in shock. "Brian," she gasped, her voice cracking. Leo turned slowly, his face a mask of panic, but I barely noticed. My focus was locked on her, the woman I thought I knew, the woman I had trusted implicitly. "What the hell is this?" The words erupted from me before I could stop them, loud and raw, shaking with fury. Angelica slid off the counter, her movements clumsy and frantic as she tried to adjust her clothes. "Brian, I can explain," she stammered, stepping toward me with her hands raised as if to calm me down. But I couldn't hear her. I couldn't hear anything over the blood pounding in my ears, the sound of my world shattering piece by piece. I turned on my heel and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind me. The bouquet of flowers still sat in the car, mocking me as I drove away. The flowers sat in the passenger seat, their vibrant petals a cruel reminder of the life I thought I had, of the joy I had been so eager to bring home just hours ago. My knuckles tightened around the steering wheel as I drove, each passing second fanning the flames of my rage and heartbreak. I glanced at the bouquet, the bright reds and yellows mocking me with their cheerfulness, and before I even realized what I was doing, I grabbed them in one furious motion. "For your love, Angelica," I bellowed, my voice hoarse with emotion, as I hurled the bouquet out of the window. The flowers scattered across the pavement behind me, crushed beneath the tires of oncoming cars. "These are for you." I pounded the steering wheel, the leather creaking under the strain of my grip. Every fiber of my being burned with anger, disbelief, and gut-wrenching sorrow. 10 years. 10 years of marriage. Of trust. Of believing we were a team. All of it shattered in an instant, obliterated by a picture I couldn't unsee. In the rearview mirror, I saw her, Angelica, running down the street, her arms flailing, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. She was calling my name, but the words didn't register. All I could see was her face twisted in desperation, her figure shrinking in the distance as I sped away. My chest tightened, the pain of it unbearable. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the death of something I thought was unbreakable. My car roared down the empty road, my screams filling the cabin. I didn't care who might see me, hear me. Tears blurred my vision, but I kept driving, the world outside a streaked haze. I screamed until my throat felt raw, the pain erupting from me in ways I couldn't control. Somehow, I ended up at a hotel on the edge of town. The bright vacancy sign buzzed overhead, casting an eerie glow on the parking lot as I pulled in. My hands trembled as I handed over my credit card at the front desk, barely registering the clerk's polite questions. Minutes later, I was sitting on the edge of a bland hotel bed, staring at the pale yellow walls and wondering how my life had spiraled into this nightmare. My phone buzzed, jolting me out of my stupor. It was her. "Angelica, Brian, please, just talk to me. I can explain everything." "Please." "Explain? Explain what?" That it wasn't what it looked like. That I'd somehow misunderstood the sight of my wife perched on the kitchen counter with another man between her legs. My fists clenched as I stared at the message, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I typed a response, my fingers shaking. "Me, I don't need your explanations. I don't want them. I don't want you. Don't contact me again." I threw the phone onto the nightstand, collapsing back onto the bed. My mind raced, replaying every moment of our marriage. The birthdays, the anniversaries, the lazy Sunday mornings. Each memory was tainted now, a painful reminder of what I thought we had. And for what? For Leo? A boy with barely a beard on his face? I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and joyless. The tears came again, this time softer, slower, as exhaustion set in. I drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by images of the kitchen, of her flushed face, of his hands on her. The pounding on the door woke me. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but then it came again, louder this time. I sat up, disoriented, my head pounding from the night before. "Brian," a voice cried, muffled by the door. "Brian, please open the door. Let me talk to you." It was Angelica. I froze, my pulse quickening. How had she found me? I sat in silence, willing her to go away, but the pounding continued, relentless. Her voice cracked with desperation. "Brian, please. I love you. Let me explain. Please." I stormed to the door, my bare feet slapping against the cold tile. My heart hammered as I unlocked the door and flung it open. There she was, her face streaked with tears, her eyes swollen and red. She reached out as if to touch me, but I stepped back, my voice cutting through her sobs like a blade. "What the hell do you want from me?" I shouted, my fury spilling over. "What more could you possibly want? Haven't you done enough?" She flinched at my words, her hands trembling as she brought them to her chest. "Brian," she began, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake, but it didn't mean anything. You have to believe me. I love you." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "You love me? That's rich, Angelica. You love me? Is that why you brought him into our home? Is that why you did what you did? Under our roof?" She sobbed harder, her words coming out in fragments. It wasn't supposed to happen. Stop," I growled, cutting her off. "I don't want to hear your excuses. Not now. Not ever." For a moment, she stood there, her tears falling silently, her shoulders shaking. Then, with a broken whisper, she said, "I'll wait, Brian. I'll wait as long as it takes for you to forgive me." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, my heart as shattered as the vows we had once made. As Angelica walked away, her shoulders hunched under the weight of her sobs, something inside me snapped. My legs moved before I could stop them, carrying me out of the doorway and down the hall. "Angelica," I called, my voice firm, my steps quickening. She froze mid-stride, turning slowly to face me, her tear-streaked face etched with a mix of hope and fear. "Come back to the hotel," I said, my tone low but commanding. "Soon?" She hesitated for a moment, her hands trembling. "Brian," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you love me?" I cut her off, my eyes locking onto hers. "Yes," she cried, the word rushing out in desperation. "Yes, yes, I do. I love you." I stepped closer, narrowing the distance between us. "Then tell me the truth," I said, my voice now colder, sharper. "Why did you cheat on me?" Her face crumpled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "It was Leo," she whispered, the name like venom on her tongue. "He started it. He flirted, he got close, and I didn't stop him. I couldn't stop him. I'm so sorry, Brian. I'm so sorry." I stared at her, the anger in my chest building like a storm. "You couldn't stop him?" I repeated, each word heavy with disbelief. "Angelica, don't insult me with that nonsense." She began, but I didn't let her finish. "Were you ready for me to come in?" I demanded, my tone colder now, dangerously calm. Her eyes widened, and she shook her head furiously. No, I wasn't. I didn't know." "Get out," I said, my voice quieter now, but no less fierce. "Get out of my sight. I don't want to see you. I don't want to hear you. Don't ever come near me again, Angelica." "Brian, please," she pleaded, reaching out, but I stepped away, raising a hand to stop her. "Go," I spat. "You've already destroyed everything. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She stood there for a moment, her face crumpling under the weight of my words, before she turned and walked away. The sound of her sobs echoed faintly as she disappeared around the corner. I went back to the hotel room, my breath heavy, my chest heaving as I started packing. I couldn't stay here. Not in this town, not in this life that now felt hollow. I stuffed clothes into a bag, my movements mechanical, my mind already somewhere else. I drove for hours, the road stretching out endlessly before me. The highway eventually gave way to quieter streets, the kind lined with aging trees and the occasional stray dog. By the time I reached my grandfather's village, the sun was beginning to set, bathing the world in soft hues of gold and orange. The old house stood at the edge of a field, its wooden frame weathered but sturdy. It was a place of simplicity, a place where life moved slower. As I stepped out of the car, the scent of freshly tilled earth filled my lungs, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I unlocked the door, the creak of the hinges a welcome sound in the silence. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and memories. I dropped my bag by the door and stood in the middle of the living room, letting the stillness wash over me. This was it, a new beginning, a place to start over, away from the betrayal, away from the pain. That night, I sat by the window, watching the stars appear one by one. For the first time in days, my mind was quiet. The anger, the sorrow, the chaos, it would take time to heal, but for now, I had found a small corner of peace. And that was enough.